The x-ray came back wrong. Not damaged, not blurred, wrong in a way that made me set down my coffee and lean closer to the screen at 6 in the morning. The boy in front of me had a fulminant leukemia that should have been hollowing out his jaw, eating the bone the way that disease always does. And instead, the film showed something I had no medical word for. 3 months later, he was dead. And for 15 years, I told no one what I had seen on that screen, because if I had said it out loud in 2006, they would have taken my license. My name is Dr. Renato Belluzzi. I was a dental and maxillofacial surgeon in Milan for 28 years. More than 9,000 patients passed through my chair, and I held membership in the Italian College of Maxillofacial Radiology, which means I read bone for a living. I did not believe in miracles. I believed in calcium density, in Hounsfield units, in the grayscale of a panoramic radiograph. I believed that the body was a machine, and that when the machine failed, it failed in predictable ways. What Carlo Acutis said to me on that last visit was not a prayer, and it was not a goodbye. It was an instruction, and it included a date that I would not understand for 14 years. That was the first thing I could not explain. The second was the small folded thing he pressed into my hand when his mother stepped out to take a phone call, the thing he told me not to open. And the third, the one that put me on my knees on a tile floor in a building I had sworn I would never enter, happened in October of 2020, in the exact city Carlo named to me, on a day I had circled without knowing why. For 15 years, I stayed silent. Today, I tell all of it. I became a dentist because my father lost all his teeth at 41, and I watched it shame him into a quiet man. That is the whole reason. One choice made at 16 that decided 30 years of my life. As for God, I went to Mass at Christmas to keep my mother happy, and I thought about my golf swing during the homily. My wife used to say I prayed only to the espresso machine, and she was not entirely wrong. I ground the beans myself every morning at 5:40, a ritual more sacred to me than any liturgy. In the early summer of 2006, a colleague from a pediatric practice in Monza referred a patient to me. The note was short. A boy of 15. Persistent inflammation along the lower left mandible. Gums bleeding without obvious cause. The family wanting a specialist opinion before the pediatrician pushed for blood work. The referral landed on my desk on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were my long surgical days, and I almost passed it to my associate. I did not. I have asked myself 10,000 times what would have happened if I had. The appointment was for the following week. I had the panoramic taken first. Standard protocol. The patient standing with his chin on the rest, the machine arcing around his head with that low mechanical hum. The technician was a woman named Julia, who had worked with me for 9 years and never once made an error I could find. She brought me the film, and she had a strange look on her face. The look of someone who has measured something twice and does not trust the second measurement. The boy was already in the chair when I came in. Dark hair, an ordinary blue sweater, a backpack at his feet with a sticker of a soccer crest peeling at one corner. He was calm in a way that 15-year-olds in a dental chair are never calm. Most of them grip the armrests. He had his hands folded in his lap, and he was looking at the crucifix that hung crooked on my wall, a cheap brass thing my mother had given me that I kept only out of guilt. "You should straighten that," he said. Not rude, almost amused. "It's the only one in the building, and it's the one thing in here that's broken." I laughed, because what else do you do? Then I looked at the gum line, and the laugh died in my throat. The inflammation was real. The tissue was angry and red, and along the lower left, there were the small hemorrhages that I had seen in patients whose blood was no longer clotting the way it should. I had read enough hematology to feel the cold start in my stomach. This was not a dental problem. This was the mouth showing me something the rest of the body was hiding. I did not say leukemia. You do not say that word to a child. I said we needed better imaging, and I told Julia to set up the appointment for a cone beam scan, the 3-dimensional one, because I wanted to see the bone in cross-section before I sent the family back to the pediatrician. with a recommendation that would change everything for them. He let me work, and while I had the small mirror in his mouth, he said, around the instrument, in that same calm voice, "You don't have to be afraid of the picture. I already know what's coming." I told him to hold still. Children say things, but the way he said it stayed with me, because it was not the way a frightened boy talks. It was the way a man talks who has already made his peace and is now waiting, patiently, for everyone else to catch up. Before he left, while his mother, an elegant woman with kind, tired eyes, whose name I would later learn was Antonia, was filling out the insurance forms at the front desk, the boy reached into the side pocket of his backpack and took out a small object wrapped in a white handkerchief. He folded it into my palm and closed my fingers over it. "Keep this," he said. "Don't open it. Not now. You'll know the day." I asked him what it was. He smiled. "Something for later. When you can't explain the picture, this is the part that explains it." Then his mother called him, and he picked up his backpack, and the soccer sticker caught the light, and he was gone down my stairs. And I stood there in my own office, holding a folded handkerchief like a fool, with no idea that I would carry it, unopened, for 14 years. I put it in a drawer, the bottom drawer of my desk, under a box of dental wax and a stack of insurance appeals. I told myself I would give it back at the next appointment. There would be no next appointment of the kind I imagined, and the picture he told me not to fear was already developing in the next room, waiting to ruin every certainty I had built over 28 years. The cone beam scan was scheduled for 10 days later, but I could not wait. That night, after the last patient, I sat alone with the panoramic film clipped to the light box, and I started measuring. Let me explain what should have been there. Fulminant leukemia, and his blood work, which the pediatrician faxed me 4 days later, would confirm an acute myeloid leukemia, the M3 subtype, the aggressive one, does specific things to the jaw. The marrow inside the mandible is one of the most metabolically active tissues in a young body. When leukemic cells flood that marrow, the bone loses density. On a radiograph, you see it as a darkening, a moth-eaten pattern radiologists actually call moth-eaten, where the trabecular structure breaks down into ragged holes. In a case as advanced as his gum tissue suggested, I expected the mandibular bone density to read well below normal. Healthy young trabecular bone in the mandible runs around 240 to 300 Hounsfield units on a calibrated scan. In active marrow infiltration, I would expect that to crash, sometimes below 100, the bone turning soft and gray. I measured his mandible at the body, just below the inflamed area. The reading was 291 Hounsfield units. Dense, healthy, denser than my own would have been at 44. I thought the machine was miscalibrated. So the next morning, I did something I had never done for a single patient before. I drove to Monza myself, to the imaging center where his cone beam was already scheduled, and I asked the technician, a man named Pharaoh, who had been running that scanner for 11 years, to run a calibration phantom before the boy's appointment. A calibration phantom is a block of material with a known density. You scan it, you check that the machine reports the value it is supposed to report. Pharaoh ran it. The machine read the phantom dead accurate, within 0.3%. So the machine was fine. And when they scanned Carlo's jaw in 3 dimensions, the cross-sections were worse, by which I mean better, by which I mean impossible. The cortical bone was intact. The trabecular pattern was ordered, regular, the little struts of bone arranged like a healthy honeycomb. I measured 11 separate regions of interest across the mandible. The lowest reading was 278 Hounsfield units. The highest was 304. This was a boy whose blood, by then, was so full of leukemic blasts that the hematologists in Monza were already preparing the family for what was coming. His marrow everywhere else in his body was failing. I had the complete blood count. His platelets were collapsing, which is exactly why his gums were bleeding. The disease was in him, devouring him, and it had touched every marrow space the doctors could sample. Except the jaw. The one bone I could see in fine detail. The one place I, of all the doctors treating him, was the specialist for. There, the marrow was not just holding, it was thriving, I called a former classmate, a radiologist in Padua named Dr. Vinciguerra, and I described the case without the name. I gave him the numbers and the diagnosis, and I asked him what could produce dense, ordered mandibular trabeculae in the face of advanced M3 leukemia. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Renato, that combination doesn't occur. If the marrow is failing systemically, it fails in the mandible too. The mandible isn't special. You've made an error in your regions of interest." I had not made an error. I redrew every region of interest by hand, twice, on 2 different days, on 2 different monitors. 278 to 304. Vinciguerra finally drove down from Padua and read the scan himself because he did not believe me, and I watched a man with 30 years of radiology experience go pale and silent in front of a glowing screen. "This is somebody else's jaw spliced into this patient's chart," he said. It was not. I had the chain of custody. I had stood in the room. That was the moment the problem stopped being technical and became something I had no profession for. I was a man who read bone for a living, and the bone was telling me a story that contradicted the blood, the diagnosis, and everything I had been taught about how a dying body dies. If what you've just heard has touched something in you, let me give you something before I go further. I prepared a novena to Carlo Acutis, completely free, so you can pray for whatever you carry inside, the way I eventually learned to. It's in the description, the first link, right below this video. Download it and pray it across these 9 days. But before I can tell you why a man like me ended up praying anything at all, I have to tell you what Vinciguerra found when he went back through the scan one more time. Because Vinciguerra did not leave it alone. He was a scientist, and a contradiction this clean offends a scientist the way a wrong note offends a musician. He stayed in my office until past midnight, and around 11, he stopped looking at the mandible and started looking everywhere else in the scan field, the way you check the corners of a photograph when the center makes no sense. A cone beam scan of the lower jaw also captures the upper cervical spine, part of the airway, and the soft tissue of the neck. And in the soft tissue, just below the angle of the mandible on the left side, Vinciguerra found a small region that the original technician at Monza had flagged with a question mark, and then, finding nothing alarming, left alone. It was a node, slightly enlarged, which in a leukemia patient means nothing. The lymphatic system is in chaos. But the density of it was the strange thing. He measured it and got a value that did not match lymphatic tissue, and did not match a tumor, and did not match the muscle around it. It read like calcified tissue, like bone that had grown where bone should never grow, in a soft node in a boy of 15. "This is dystrophic calcification," Vinciguerra said, "but it's too organized. Look at the matrix." Under magnification, the calcified region had a faint internal structure, almost laminar, like the growth rings of something that had been forming over years, not the random spatter of dying tissue. I want to be precise about why this mattered, because at the time I did not understand it, and I almost dismissed it. Dystrophic calcification, the random kind, looks like static, like spilled salt. What Vinciguerra was showing me had order, and the boy was 15. Whatever had made that structure had been building inside him quietly, ordered, for most of his life. I marked the coordinates of that node in my own notebook. I did not know yet that it would matter. I only knew that the jaw was impossibly healthy, and that there was, embedded in the neck of a dying child, a small, ordered structure that I could not name. 2 anomalies now, not 1. And I am a man who, when he finds 2 things he cannot explain, does not sleep. We took it to a third reader. I sent the anonymized scan to a maxillofacial radiology unit in Vienna, to a professor whose textbook I had studied from, a woman named Professor Kohler. I sent only the images and the bare diagnosis, no name, no commentary, because I wanted her unprejudiced read. She replied by fax. This was 2006. We still faxed. 4 days later. The fax was 2 pages. The first page was her measurements, which matched mine within 5 Hounsfield units across the board, vindicating me and burying Vinciguerra's theory of an error. The second page was a single handwritten line beneath her signature. It said, "Doctor, I have read 14,000 of these. The mandible in this patient is not merely preserved, it is consistent with a bone that is actively rebuilding. I have only ever seen this pattern in heel-in fractures and in laboratory bone grafts under ideal conditions. In a patient with systemic marrow failure, I cannot explain it, and I would ask you not to send me cases like this without warning me first. Actively rebuilding, not surviving the disease, reversing it in one location, while the rest of the body lost the war." I did not tell the family. What would I have said? Your son is dying, and also one bone in his body is doing something that violates everything I know? It would have sounded like cruelty or madness. So I filed the scans and the facts and Vinciguerra's notes in a sealed folder, and I went to Monza to see the boy one more time, because by then it was September, and the hematologists had moved him into the San Gerardo hospital, and there was very little time left. He was in a bed by the window, thinner. The disease had finally reached his face, the pallor of it, the bruising along his arms from the constant blood draws. But his eyes were the same eyes that had looked at my crooked crucifix, and when he saw me, he smiled like I was an old friend arriving at a party. "You measured it," he said. Not a question. I had told no one outside 3 doctors in 3 countries. I had not breathed a word to him or his family about the density or the node or Kohler's facts. I stood at the foot of his bed with my hands cold, and I asked him what he meant. "The jaw," he said. "You couldn't make it match. That's all right. It's not supposed to match." He shifted against the pillows. "You'll understand the picture, but not here, and not now. You'll understand it in the city where I was born, on the 10th day of the 10th month, in a building full of sick people. You'll be the one who's sick that day, and you'll remember you were afraid of the picture, and you'll stop being afraid." The city where he was born. I did not know then that Carlo Acutis was born in London on the 3rd of May, 1991. I learned it years later, and when I learned it, the floor tilted under me, because of what would happen to me in October of 2020, in a hospital, in a particular city, on the 10th day of the 10th month. But I am getting ahead of myself, and that is the open door he left me, hanging in the air over a hospital bed. His mother came in then with 2 coffees and offered me one, and I could not drink it. I left. I drove back to Milan, and I did not understand that I had just heard a man read my future the way I read his bone. He died on the 12th of October, 2006. I read it in a small notice. 15 years old. I told myself the jaw was an artifact I would explain someday with better physics. I put the folder away. I left the handkerchief in the drawer, and I went back to fillings and extractions and the espresso machine. And for a long time, the only sign that any of it had happened was a crooked crucifix I had, without quite deciding to, finally straightened on the wall. For a while, I almost forgot. 3 years passed. 4. I told myself a story in which there was a measurement error in the calibration, or a fluke of the patient's individual physiology, some genetic quirk that protected one bone. Doctors are very good at telling themselves stories. We do it for the families, and then we do it for ourselves. But the node would not leave me. That small, ordered, calcified structure in the neck. In the spring of 2010, I attended a maxillofacial congress in Bologna, and during a session on imaging artifacts, a young researcher presented work on something called heterotopic ossification, bone forming in soft tissue, and she showed slides, and on one of her slides was a magnified calcification with a faint laminar internal structure, the growth ring pattern, and I felt the hair stand up on my arms in a darkened lecture hall. I cornered her afterward. Her name was Dr. Sabatini, and she was sharp and impatient, and I liked her immediately. I described the node, the order, the laminar matrix, the patient, who was a child with a systemic disease. She frowned and said the pattern I was describing was not heterotopic ossification at all. The growth rings were too regular. That's not the body's mistake, she said. That looks deposited, layered, almost the way a pearl forms around a grain of sand. Something irritated that tissue over years, and the body kept laying down ordered mineral in response. Do you know what irritated it? I did not. But that night in my hotel room in Bologna, I took out my old folder, which I had brought, I'm not sure why, as if I had known the Congress would reopen the wound. And I looked at the coordinates of the node, and I looked at the panoramic film, and I did the geometry I had been too afraid to do in 2006. The node sat directly along the path of the lower left mandibular nerve canal, near the inflamed gum tissue, near the exact site that had first sent the boy to me. Whatever was layering ordered mineral in that node, it was forming right where his disease first announced itself in his mouth. The place that brought him to my chair was the place his body had spent 15 years quietly building a small, ordered stone. I want to tell you what that did to me, because this is the part where the man I had been started to come apart. I was a person who believed the body was a machine that fails predictably, and here was a machine that, in one boy, had refused to fail in one bone, and had instead built an ordered structure, over years, at the precise location that would later open the door to his death, and through it, to me. I went back to Vinciguerra. He had aged. He listened to the Sabatini theory, and he did not laugh, which from him was extraordinary. Renato, he said, I've thought about that scan more than I've thought about almost any case in my career, and I've never told anyone, because what is there to say? The mandible was rebuilding, and there was an ordered stone forming in his neck. I have no mechanism. I have nothing. I'm a radiologist, and I'm telling you I have nothing. He paused. Did the boy ever say anything to you? Anything strange? I told him what Carlo had said. The city where I was born, the 10th day of the 10th month, a building full of sick people, and you'll be the sick one. Vinciguerra wrote it down. He was a methodical man. Find out where he was born, he said. If you're going to be haunted, at least be haunted accurately. It took me an afternoon. I called the practice in Monza that had originally referred the boy, and a kind woman pulled the old record, and she read me the line. Born in London, the 3rd of May, 1991. Italian parents. I sat with the phone in my hand. London. I had never been to London in my life. I had no reason to go to London. And the prediction, which I had carried for 4 years like a stone in my own neck, suddenly had an address attached to it. And the address was a city I did not know, and a date, the 10th of October, that meant nothing to me at all. That was when I finally went looking for who Carlo Acutis had actually been, because until then he had been a patient, a remarkable boy, a contradiction in my files. I had never typed his name into a search engine. I did, in 2010, in my home office at midnight, and the first page that came up changed the temperature of the room. If you downloaded that novena I mentioned, you already know the kind of stillness I mean. If you haven't yet, it's still there, the first link in the description. Pray it for whoever in your life needs it most. And if these stories are starting to mean something to you, this channel is where I keep gathering them. But what I read on the screen that night changed even the way I held my own folder. Because the boy I had measured, the 15-year-old in the blue sweater, had built something with his short life that I had never imagined. From the age of 11, Carlo Acutis had been cataloging Eucharistic miracles. He taught himself to code, and he built a website, a single boy at a computer, documenting more than 160 cases of Eucharistic miracles from across the centuries and across the world, with photographs and locations and the scientific findings where they existed. He had done what I did. He had measured the unexplainable and refused to look away from it. People online were already calling him the first millennial saint, God's influencer, the patron of the internet, though none of those titles were official yet. And the Eucharistic miracles he had catalogued, I read them that night with the cold professional eye I bring to everything, were again and again the same phenomenon I had found in him: tissue that should have decayed and did not, hosts that, when examined, showed cardiac tissue, ordered, alive in the structural sense, where there should have been only bread, bodies that refused to follow the rules of decay. The boy had spent his childhood documenting flesh that disobeyed biology, and then his own body had done the same thing under my instruments, and he had handed me a folded handkerchief and told me I would understand the picture. I learned more. His mother, Antonia Salzano, had spoken publicly after his death about how Carlo seemed to know things. He had told her, before he was diagnosed, that he would offer his suffering for the Pope and for the Church. He had said he would not live long. He had picked the place he wished to be buried, Assisi, the city of St. Francis, though he was born in London and lived in Milan, because he loved it. And that is where his tomb is now, in the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore. I read that in 2010, the year before his body would be exhumed. In 2019, they opened the tomb, as is done in causes for sainthood, and the report said the body was found integral, preserved. I read those reports the way I read everything, looking for the catch, the embalming, the conditions, the explanation. And I kept hearing under everything the line of a boy in a hospital bed. It's not supposed to match. I still had the handkerchief. I had moved it from the desk drawer to a small wooden box in my study, but I had kept my word, and in 14 years I had never unfolded it. I would take out the box sometimes and hold it and feel the small, hard thing inside through the cloth, and put it back. I told myself I was honoring a dying boy's wish. The truth is, I was afraid, because he had said I would know the day, and I did not want there to be a day. I did not want my comfortable disbelief disturbed by whatever was wrapped in white cotton. By 2020, I had nearly convinced myself, again, that I would die an old skeptic with an unopened handkerchief and an unexplained scan, and a strange story I would never tell. I was wrong about that, the way I had been wrong about everything that mattered. Because in the spring of that year, the world filled up with a sickness, and in the autumn of that year, I became, exactly as a 15-year-old had promised me, the sick one, in a building full of sick people, in a city I had never been to, on the 10th day of the 10th month. It started with a fever I ignored. I was 62 by then, and I thought myself indestructible in the stupid way men think that. I had been traveling, and this is the part one still cannot tell without my hands going cold. I had finally gone to London. Not for Carlo, for a conference, postponed and rescheduled 3 times by the pandemic, on advances in maxillofacial reconstruction, finally held in the autumn of 2020 under heavy restrictions. I almost did not go. My wife told me not to go. I went because the keynote was on bone regeneration, the very mystery that had haunted me for 14 years, and I could not stay away from it. I flew into London at the start of October. I had not connected it. I swear to you, I had not connected the city. Carlo's birthplace had become an abstract fact in a folder, and I was a tired surgeon chasing a lecture on bone, and it was only on the second night, in my hotel room, jet-lagged and feverish, and not yet admitting I was feverish, that I opened my laptop to check the conference schedule and saw the city name at the top of the program, and felt the floor tilt the way it had tilted 10 years before. London, the city where he was born, and the fever was climbing. By the morning of October 9th, I could not stand. The hotel called an ambulance. I remember pieces: the oxygen mask, a nurse's eyes above a mask, the only part of her face I could see. The pneumonia had filled the lower lobes of both my lungs, and my oxygen saturation was dropping into the low 80s, and then below, and I was admitted, in London, to a hospital wing full of people drowning in the same sickness I was drowning in, a building full of sick people, and I was the sick one. I did not have the handkerchief with me. It was in the wooden box in my study in the lawn, 1,400 kilometers away, and I lay in that bed on the night of the 9th of October with a tube delivering oxygen into my nose. And I understood. with a clarity that fever sometimes gives instead of taking, that the day had come, and I was not ready, and the one thing he had told me to keep for this day was on another continent. I called my wife. It was the middle of the night in the lawn. I told her where the box was. I told her, and she thought I was delirious, and perhaps I was, to open the handkerchief and read me what was inside, over the phone. She found the box. I heard her unwrap the cloth in my ear, 1,400 kilometers away, on the 10th of October, 2020, the 10th day of the 10th month. Inside the handkerchief there was a small medal, an ordinary miraculous medal, the kind sold in any church shop, worn smooth as if it had been held a great deal. And folded around it, so small she almost missed it, a slip of paper in a teenager's handwriting. She read it to me slowly, because the writing was small. It said, "When you are the one in the bed, and you are afraid of the picture, remember, the bone that rebuilds is the proof. Nothing real is ever finally lost. I will pray for you in London. Carlo, 2006. In London. He had written London in 2006, when I did not know where he was born, when I had no plan ever to go to London, 4 years before I would even learn his birthplace, 14 years before I would lie dying of pneumonia in a London hospital on the 10th of October. He had written the city. He had written the circumstance. He had written it and folded it into a handkerchief and handed it to a man who measured bone for a living, and told him not to open it until the day. I do not know how to make you believe me. I am a man trained to disbelieve, and I believe this because I held the medical facts in my own hands for 14 years, and I held the slip of paper, by proxy, over a phone line on the exact night he named. The bone that rebuilds is the proof. My body that night was failing the way his had failed, everywhere except his jaw. And I lay there, and I did the only thing I had never done sincerely in 62 years. I prayed. I prayed to a boy I had measured, the first millennial saint, God's influencer, and I told him I was afraid of the picture, and I asked him to keep his promise and pray for me in London. My oxygen saturation that night was 83% and falling, and the doctor on the ward had spoken to me gently, the way I had once spoken to families, about what might come. I do not claim a miracle. I am too careful a man to claim what I cannot measure. I can only tell you the numbers, the way I always have. By the morning of the 11th, my saturation had climbed to 91%, without a change in my treatment. By the 13th, I was off the high-flow oxygen. The consultant called my recovery faster than the curve we're seeing, and wrote it in my chart, and moved on to the next bed, because he had 40 other people drowning, and no time for one old Italian dentist's gratitude. When they discharged me, I asked for my chest films. Of course I did. I am who I am. And in the lower lobes of my lungs, where the infection had been worst, the tissue had healed with an order and a speed that the radiologist noted as unusually well-organized regeneration for the patient's age. Unusually well-organized regeneration. I sat in a London discharge lounge and I read those words and I laughed. And then I wept, because I had read words exactly like them once before, 14 years earlier, in a fax from Vienna about a dying boy's jaw. Actively rebuilding, unusually well-organized. The bone that rebuilds is the proof. Nothing real is ever finally lost. I flew home a different man. I do not mean that as a phrase. I mean, my wife met me at the airport and said I looked at her like I was seeing her, which I suppose I had stopped doing somewhere in the long machine years of my disbelief. If this testimony has marked you the way it marked the whole second half of my life, I ask you one thing. Subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. On this channel, we keep gathering the traces Carlo left across the world, and there are more of them than you would ever believe. And if you want to carry something of this story with you, the free novena to Carlo Acutis is in the description, the first link below the video. Pray it, share it, and keep his memory alive.
There is a little more to tell, because the world caught up to what I had been hiding. In October of 2020, the very month I lay in that London bed, Carlo Acutis was beatified by Pope Francis in Assisi. I did not know it was happening while it happened. I was unconscious half the time and on oxygen the rest. I learned it after, that the boy who promised to pray for me in London had been raised to the altars in the same week I nearly died, and did not. I do not say that proves anything. I only know what I lived. And on the 7th of September, 2025, he was canonized by Pope Leo XIV in the Jubilee year, declared a saint of the Universal Church, the first of his generation. I was there. I traveled to Rome, an old dentist with healed lungs and a sealed folder full of measurements, and I stood in the crowd, and I wept like the women around me, who held rosaries and photographs and had loved him for years longer than I had. After that, I stopped being silent. I contacted the office handling the cause, and through a long and careful process, I gave my testimony and my documentation: the panoramic, the cone beam, Vinci Guerra's notes, Kohler's facts, Sabatini's analysis of the node, my own London chest films, to the people who study these things with more rigor than I ever could. I do not know what they will make of a jaw that rebuilt while a body failed, or of an ordered stone in a child's neck, or of a slip of paper that named a city no one could have known. I am a witness, not a judge. I gave them what I measured. I met Antonia Salzano once, briefly, after the canonization. I told her that her son had handed me a medal and a note in 2006 and told me not to open it until the day. She did not look surprised. She has heard many such stories now, from many people, across the world. She took my hand, and she said, "He used to say the Eucharist was his highway to heaven. He left little signs everywhere, for people who needed them. He must have known you would need a long time." A long time. 14 years for a man who reads bone for a living to read the one thing he could not measure, and finally believe it. I still grind my coffee at 5:40 every morning. I still straighten crucifixes when I find them crooked, in waiting rooms, in churches, anywhere, because of a boy who told me it was the one broken thing in my office. I keep the handkerchief and the medal and the slip of paper in the wooden box, and now I open it whenever I like, because the day has come and gone, and there is nothing left to be afraid of. The bone that rebuilds is the proof. Nothing real is ever finally lost. Carlo Acutis said the Eucharist was his highway to heaven. I am a man who spent his life measuring what the body does when it dies, and I am telling you, from the other side of my own death that wasn't, that the traces of heaven are everywhere. You only have to know how to look.